You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
All right, on today's show, I have Pete Quinones. He is the managing editor of the Libertarian Institute, which is, of course, where I produce my daily news roundup, and this show can be found. You also find Pete's show, Free Man Beyond the Wall, the great libertarian podcast, on that homepage. Pete also does 3 shows a week, I believe, same schedule, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. He's the author of a couple books, and he writes a weekly column at the Libertarian Institute. So, Pete, thank you for joining me on today's show.
Always a pleasure, man. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, I'm excited about the topic I have to talk to you about today because, you know, you've just been so great on libertarian philosophy, and you are willing to take on some of, the most extreme things in the most ingrained superstitions of our society. And that's what you do in your columns at the Libertarian Institute. And so the thing I want to talk about today is the state's right to kill and kind of the libertarian philosophy and morality behind that. And kind of starting on, I don't know, in some ways the most inhumane because it just seems so like a slow moving process and personal. But that's the death penalty. That happened recently. That this, was thrust into, the general awareness of our society, in the wake of this coronavirus with Nathaniel Woods, a man who actually immediately didn't kill anybody, and yet the state went ahead and took his life anyway. So, Pete, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the libertarian position on the death penalty, and then how it is that the state could just, get away with murdering somebody and nobody could do anything about it.
That's kind of an it's odd to think about because I'm not one of these people who is totally against eye for an eye. But I'm against the state doing it because the state's a monopoly. They don't do anything well. I mean, some people will even say, oh, well, they kill and blow things up. Well, no, they don't. They don't do that. They don't do that well at all. So I just don't believe that the state should have that power. It just doesn't make any sense to me because if anyone was going to have the power to kill somebody, it would be the damaged party. Like, say a man was killed and, the wife, the family would be the damaged party. The state's never the damaged party when they bring a suit. But, I was listening to, I was reminded today, somebody was doing a podcast. I think Status Quo did a podcast on Anatomy of the State. And in Rothbard's Anatomy of the State, he reminds everybody that the state takes it way more seriously when you commit a crime against them than when you commit a crime against a normal person. And I guess the way the philosophy of the state would work in the death penalty is if somebody's willing to kill another person, then they'd be willing to kill, they'd have no problem killing somebody from the state. You always see that where when a police officer is killed or a federal agent is killed, it's supposed to be so much worse than if you or I got killed by somebody. Yeah, the death penalty thing, I don't know. In a libertarian society, there are so many different theories. Bob Murphy has theories on it. I mean, I would have no problem with the family enslaving the person or even killing the person who, killed, who damaged them. But as far as the state goes, I mean, they're not the ones. There's, first of all, the United States versus, or was it, I think it might have been state of Alabama versus Nathaniel Wood. Well, state of Alabama doesn't exist. It's a fiction in law. So the state of Alabama is not damaged by the person who was killed in the Nathaniel Woods case. So it doesn't really make any sense that why would the state be doing this? Because the state has whoever this person was that got killed, how did it hurt the state? So it's just for order? How orderly is it to put somebody to death? To basically say, okay, because you took this person's life, we're going to take your life. But the state has no right to do that, because there's no damaged party. No one from the state can step up and say, I was hurt by this. I was affected by this. I think that's where my thinking goes when I think about the death penalty. I just don't think the state should have that right, especially considering, like I've already said, they don't do anything right. And now it comes out more and more that people who've been put to death by the state have been exonerated, and people who've been on death row for 20 years are exonerated and walk and everything. How can the state be trusted? I mean, the state can't even keep the roads, passable and drivable. And you want to put people's lives in their hands? It just doesn't make it. And not to mention, they're the biggest murderers on the planet. Immediately I think of Waco. I mean, they're the biggest murderers on the planet, and no one from the FBI or the ATF or Delta Force or British SAS, if they had anything to do with it. I know they were on the ground there. No one got prosecuted or suffered from that. I mean, they're dropping bombs on people as we're talking right now, and they're killing people. Why do they get to do that? And if I kill somebody else, they want to put me to death. It just doesn't. There seems to be a real problem here and a real disconnect that most people don't think about.
Right. Well, to stick on the death penalty for just a minute, I have seen like documentaries. There's a good one on Netflix recently, I think The Innocent Man, where one of the victim's mother in the case talks about how she doesn't want the guy to get the death penalty because there's then more appeals in the process and stuff like that. And so, as you were saying, the victims should have more of a reason to be like, versus being the state of Alabama where it's this imaginary state figure. But one of the interesting things I find with like the case of the death penalty is there are so many appeals, and so this has been so clearly unjust for so long, and yet everybody kind of just plays their part. At one point the Supreme Court, I guess, was looking to intervene and prevent this. People went to the governor. There's been, again, appeals in courts. Nobody had to press the button. The guards could have, I suppose, refused to bring this guy and strap him into the lethal ejection chair. And yet, even though everybody knows, has to know it's unjust because the details of the case are just so factual, it's just allowed to happen. And I don't know if you have a good way to explain how that is.
I don't, man. I mean, it's the most bizarre thing to me that they get to do this. That the people who were actually suffered loss don't really get a say in it. I mean, think about it. If the state wants to prosecute somebody and bring about the death penalty, and like you said, the person who was hurt by this, the one whose family member was killed, they don't get a say in it. So that just doesn't it doesn't make any sense at all. It's like if somebody stole something from me and we hired an arbitrator, a private arbitrator, if somebody stole something from you, is it more important to you that they be punished for it, or that you get some kind of restitution? See, I'm more along the lines of restitution, especially if that person, has to actually work in order to, whatever they stole from you, they destroyed or they sold or something like that. And they would have to work in order to return to you whatever they took. I mean, that's what I think would be the greatest deterrent, that I could think of. I mean, or you could just send them to jail. I'll never get recompense at all. And that person goes into jail and probably learns how to be a better criminal while they're in there. I mean, it's a very odd system. And it really, when you really sit down and you think about it and you examine it, it's illogical. there's no logic to it whatsoever. There's nothing there.
Yeah, it's interesting too, and you point out that have these people work for you or something like that. If they're a criminal, they destroy your property. If somebody immediately jumps to the slavery thing or something like that, I mean, what's going on in the U.S. prisons now, where prisoners are, like a lot of times incentivized or motivated to accept these work program jobs where they make $1 or $2 an hour, doing like call center stuff or some kind of physical labor. And, then they're extorted in the prisons. It costs like $5 a minute for a phone call or something ridiculous like that with the money. And the alternative is if you don't take the job, they put you in solitary confinement sometimes. So that's far worse than anything, having some guy work for restitution for you for a couple weeks or something like that, where the punishment could actually be something of localized justice, where people feel like, they have their, justice met and their loss, made up for. But it is interesting that, like, if you watch TV and you see a show where some local police like hear about a stolen car or something like that, they pretty much laugh at the guy thinking that he's ever going to get his property back.
Yeah, I mean, fiction, they tell us a lot in fiction. But yeah, I mean, yeah, the whole, I wrote an article, I can't remember when it was. It might have been a year ago or something. And I actually went down the numbers and looked at, I mean, some of those jobs that they take, pay them $1 or $2 an hour, but it depends on the state. The state gets to dictate that. And there are some states where it's like 10 cents. There's some states where it's like a quarter. So, yeah, I mean, I know that there could be some people listening to this who go, well, if they're getting paid, it's not slavery, but, like you said, then if they want to call their loved one, it's like $5 a minute, and then there's the other argument that, well, why do you feel sorry for them? They committed a crime. Well, how do you know they committed a crime? They could be innocent, or they could have there are a lot of people who are taking plea deals right now, because what the state does is it says, okay, you can take this plea deal of 2 years, or we're going to try you for 25 years. And I recently did an episode on my podcast where my friend Slappy, he actually nullified a federal drug case and, got a couple of them, a few of the defendants not guilty and the rest mistrials. And he said that when they went back to deliberate that first day, they were all just like, okay, let's just say guilty and go home. So, one thing that I got from talking to Slappy is I understand why all these people are taking pleas and not wanting to go to trial, because just the fact that you're sitting in that defendant's chair, people are looking at you like, well, if he's there, he must be guilty of something. So, yeah, I mean, it's a broken system, and to trust it, if it's so broken that, they scare someone with 25 years so that they can take 2, and they get them in there and they do, pay them $1 an hour to, make calls to try and get people to vote for Michael Bloomberg. Why would you trust them to get a death penalty case right? It doesn't make any sense. It's not logical if people really took the time to sit down and actually care about it.
Right. Well, I always had this fantasy where somehow, there's 12 people on the jury and libertarians make up, some very small percentage, but still of the population. If we could all get, really on our game with the jury nullification and stuff like that, you could really make a difference in some of these drug law cases, and maybe more and more people will be willing to take the chance at trial. Because you only, in a lot of places, you do only need just one, random libertarian on the jury to be there and say, screw that, I don't believe the cops, that this law is nothing anyways, and, get a mistrial or get people found not guilty. And that's absolutely heroic work that he did. In a way, that's a good place to transition, because this has happened a few times, looking at like the Bundys or Ruby Ridge, where the juries have actually come to find that people innocent not of crimes, but of alleged crimes committed against like federal police when the federal police were the aggressors. One of these times is Waco, and so here again you have a long siege. I'm sure my audience is very familiar with all the details, but how, we know the end result is the Branch Davidians' murder, and how the hell did the police get away with this? How is it fair that they get to kill these people? And what would libertarianism do to stop this?
Well, I mean, when I interviewed David Thibodeau, who was one of the 9 survivors of the Waco massacre, he told me, he said, one thing he noticed during that whole siege was, and especially on the first day, February 28th, when it was just this hour-long shootout that finally ended when the ATF ran out of bullets. He said he noticed that the ATF had on the front of their uniforms or the front of their jackets this very little small ATF logo, and on the back, emblazoned in huge letters, is ATF. And he said that's because the press is always standing behind the ATF filming. So what they see is they see ATF, good guys, and whoever the direction they're shooting in, whoever they're shooting at, they must be the bad guys. So, I mean, how do the federal police get away with killing people? I think it's very simple. It's because no one's standing up and saying they shouldn't be able to. I mean, there are people I talk to still who say things about Waco like, they were cooking meth. They were cooking meth there. They were raping babies there. He was a cult leader. They set themselves on fire. That they set the fire on purpose because they were a suicide cult. All of this stuff was debunked by the 1995 House hearing, and then the 1997 Waco Rules of Engagement documentary, where and then 98 Waco, A New Revelation, when FBI agents finally started coming forward and saying, yeah, we lied. But people don't know that. People don't know that all this happened. They just go and what's funny is some of the people that I've had come at me about this and say, you don't know what you're talking about. I know what happened there. Some of these people are the same people who would say that anything that comes out of the mainstream media is fake news. Well, where'd you get your information from on this? And then the cognitive dissonance just slams them in the head, and they get upset because they've known this for all these years. But where'd you get it from? From the same place that the same people you call fake news? I mean, until Waco happened because it was allowed to happen. Ruby Ridge happened because people allow it to happen. The Bundy Ranch happened because people allowed it. People allowed it to happen. Now, a great thing about Bundy was they fought back and won, but that took some time, and the Bureau of Land Management did a really good job of doing what they always do. Oh, they're white supremacists and this and that, just like they said about the Branch Davidians, even though half the Branch Davidians were black or Mexican. Always the same story, just demonized. They're hurting. It's like Scott Horton likes to say, says, what they did with David Koresh is the same thing that they did with Saddam Hussein. Oh, he's hurting his own people. Since he's hurting his own people, we can't allow that to happen. If he'll hurt his own people, how is he not dangerous to the rest of us? Yeah, but to come back to your question, because we allow it to happen, because no one's saying to stop. No one's saying no, that shouldn't happen. You shouldn't go kill people because you don't agree with their religious beliefs. And let me add this. Ruby Ridge, perfect example. Ruby Ridge. Randy Weaver expected, I think he was living in Ohio, and he thought there was a race war was coming, and he wanted nothing to do with it. So he moved to northern Idaho, about a mile away from the Canadian border, to hide out. And they followed him, and they entrapped him, and they tried to get him to turn state's evidence on people that he had been they tried to get him to spy on people he had been hanging out with. That guy, all he wanted to do was be left alone. Every once in a while, people tell libertarians, oh, well, if you don't like the way things are, why don't you move to the woods? Randy Weaver, literally did that. And the state went there, killed his 14-year-old son, and shot his wife in the face while he was holding a baby, while she was holding their baby. These people will find you wherever you are, and they'll kill you, and nothing will happen.
Yeah, well, that is kind of the game, isn't? They try to entrap you, and if it doesn't work out legally and they can't, arrest you and claim you're a terrorist or a white supremacist, then they surround you and kill you. They do the same thing, now with these young Muslim men who, they meet some girl, quote unquote, FBI agent online, and she's like, oh, look how terrible America is, don't you want to kill the Americans? And he's like, oh yeah, you're a girl and you showed me all these videos. And they do some of the videos that I'm sure are fairly graphic and do show US war crimes. And so, it's very easy to see. And then even when they try to back out and say, you know what, I'm really not into killing people, they'll be like, are you weak or something like that? And imagine, a young man's going to definitely feel, that kind of, social or cultural pressure or whatever to be like, oh, I'm a real tough man, because, that's like kind of the shaming that the FBI does. It's absolutely incredible. And it's just, as we've said, allowed to happen. It's quite amazing. I will say, one thing you said, I guess with the Bundys, in a sense, it wasn't allowed to happen, because I believe all the charges got dropped against all of them at this point too, and they for the most part ran the BLM. Right, BLM, yeah, out of there. Yeah, sorry, the Black Lives Matter thing. That coincidence was quite problematic for a time.
Yeah, but the like you just said, but one of the things you mentioned how they entrap Muslim men. Notice what you said there. They don't entrap Muslim men by saying, do you see how women dress in America? Do you see how much freedom people have in America? No. What do they say? Yeah, they're dropping bombs over there. And then when people say, well, terrorism has nothing to do with our foreign policy, well, then why isn't it? Because they hate us for our freedoms. Then how come they're not antagonizing and radicalizing these young Muslim men by talking about our freedoms and talking about, how women, women have equal rights in this country and everything? No, it's always mentioning the foreign policy of the United States. Just really interesting.
So, yeah, talking about foreign policy a little bit, another place where the state just gets to kill people is with drone strikes and assassinations. And, especially under the Obama administration, it really was never called what it is, a targeted assassination. I guess more or less the first time here recently with Soleimani, we have a more targeted kind of assassination. But, Pete, from a libertarian perspective, these drone strikes, you just go and kill people on the other side of the world? How's that work?
I mean, there's two countries in this world that can basically kill people, anyone that they want, and they never answer for it. And that's the United States and Israel. They can just do whatever they want, and no other country is going to say anything about it. I mean, there are other countries that say things about it, but those are the enemy. Russia, if Vladimir Putin says something about it, then the Russia has to be taken out. Or if Syria, if Assad says something, or if, the clerics in Iran say something, well, they're the enemy, but, what's his name, in North Korea, Kim, if he starves his own people and puts his own people in concentration camps, he's like the worst person in the world. Yet the United States has a higher per capita prison population than North Korea does, and China. And North Korea is not bombing other countries and killing people in other countries. But the United States gets to go do that so that Boeing and Northrop Grumman can basically cash in. I mean, unless somebody wants to explain to me how, drone strikes in Pakistan today, were keeping me safe. I think it's gotten to the point where it's just, if you say something, the United States the United States government is going to do whatever it wants to do. They're going to kill whoever they want. If they drop it on a wedding and they don't get their man, but everyone in the wedding dies and they were all innocent, I'm sure somebody will find a way to say, oh, well, if they're Muslim, they're not innocent, but it's just people eating up propaganda. And I just think other countries just aren't saying anything because they're scared that the United States will put the bullseye on them. Yeah, and like they do with so many countries now.
Right. I mean, the Trump administration has been absolutely ruthless with the sanctions regime. And so you imagine like one of these countries standing up and saying something. Well, then so either people within like, that government or a certain sector industry of that country will end up getting like sanctioned or blacklisted. And so, the limited recourse and the fact that, nobody can stand up on the international stage. And yeah, it's just allowed to happen. And I don't know.
Well, think about this, okay? All this talk about the coronavirus, okay? China could be tens of thousands of people can die from the coronavirus there, and they're burning the bodies and they don't report it. That means China's terrible, worst country in the world. The United States is come under fire because they haven't acted quickly enough, and now people here are dying from it, and people are getting sick from it. What about Yemen? Let's see. The United States has been backing Saudi Arabia's plan to basically have a genocide in Yemen where they're just killing everyone. I mean, they're dropping. If a hospital gets rebuilt, they bomb it. If a water filtration plant gets rebuilt, they bomb it. Food, it's all destroyed. And there's a blockade, so nothing can get in. And anytime anybody points this out, it's like, well, Al-Qaeda is working there or Iran is working there. I mean, that's the big thing is whenever you want to criticize anything the United States is doing in the Middle East, you have to invoke as soon as someone invokes Iran, then it makes it okay. Everything. But I mean, from the lowest estimates we have for Yemen is 50,000, 100,000 dead. It's probably much more than that because, reporting out of there is just awful. But and that's targeted, done on purpose. But the coronavirus, but China has 10,000 people died in China because, I mean, who has 1.6 billion people? I mean, imagine the age of the population, the elderly and everything. But, let's talk about how they didn't stop this and they didn't start talking about it quick enough where no one has any evidence that China did it on purpose. I mean, they could have. Their government is evil as any other government, but the United States has been functionally seeking to commit genocide in a country using Saudi as their proxy, and no one wants to talk about that. No one wants it, but everybody wants to talk about every other country that does bad stuff. It's frustrating, man. It's frustrating to be one of the people who realizes just how wrong this is. But, I'm not going to shut up about it. I don't really care what people say, and, you talk about things in Syria, you could put troops in harm's way. Chelsea Manning put troops, got troops killed. No evidence for that one. Talking about this stuff, you could put troops in harm's way. No evidence for that whatsoever. But the United States will point to other countries who are doing nowhere near as bad things as the United States government is doing at this exact moment. And people are like, hey, it's our government. They're seeking to keep us safe or some kind of hyperbolic crap like that.
Right. Well, it is, as you talked about with the media and the Waco situation, just the way things are covered and portrayed are so important. And just imagine, Pete, if just one day, the media covered Yemen like they cover the coronavirus, where every statement made, literally every word is broken down, every sentence analyzed and commented on, every death is tracked, every dead person profiled and talked about in the media. That would have such a huge impact on the war so quickly, and yet they've been silent on it for 5 years now. And we're coming up just a couple of weeks now from, I guess, the 5-year mark of this war, and there's not even a day's worth of coverage in the mainstream media. And so that, and the fact that even when they do cover it, it's always, kind of immediately, oh, the Saudi good guys against the Iranian bad guys. And that's what's going on here in Yemen. Yeah, it's a humanitarian catastrophe, but once you know it, the Iranians just won't give up. And so we have to keep going with it. and it's not, I guess, really questioned. And I think that is a big part of kind of how everything they get away with everything. It's just nobody talks about it.
It's come out in recent years that CNN admitted it a couple of years ago that they get information from the CIA and they just report it. And when you're getting information from the CIA, what do you use to fact check that? I mean, you're just basically being a parrot for the CIA. So if that happens all the time, why would we be shocked that there's nothing there criticizing Yemen or criticizing what's going on in Syria? I mean, the gas attacks in Syria, the alleged gas attacks over the last 7 years have been proven to all be fake. But the press is MSNBC, CNN, Fox. I mean, are they reporting on it, and harping on it so that people know that? Well, not if they're not if their scripts are being handed to them by people who are orchestrating these. So, I mean, that's why people can't, and that's one of the big problems that I've really been trying to harp on a lot lately is people in this country do not believe anything unless they hear it on the news. I mean, you can talk about how the Gulf of Tonkin was, that incident didn't happen all you want. I mean, the documents have been declassified, but no one, unless somebody has heard it on the evening news, they don't believe it. And that's just odd, especially when almost every one of those people is walking around with a high-speed computer in their pocket where they can just do a search and they can find out all this information. I guess, listening to music and playing games on it, and talking to their, I mean, I must have saw so many, I noticed so many people today just on their phone talking to friends or relatives or whatever. And, and just, it's such a distraction. And people could find all this stuff out and, really start making a movement and not worry about what's being said on the evening news. I mean, stuff on the evening news that is just proven to be false all the time. I mean, and they never retract it. And it's like newspapers used to do when I was growing up. Newspaper was the way you got your news. That and the 6 o'clock and the 11 o'clock evening news. And if the newspaper made a mistake on a headline story, they did the retraction the next day on page 29. So most people went the next day with that thinking that what they read on the front page was true. And now it just carries over into cable news and especially network news.
Right. Well, I guess I'm not great at asking questions, but I think the big question I want to ask you here is the next time there's and if there is another like chemical weapons allegation in Syria, part of what the media will say is we know it's Assad because it's always Assad, even though, as you said, everybody knows it. All the claims that it has been Assad in the past is a lie. And so, by that logic, they should conclude, I guess, that Assad is likely being framed or something like, but that's not what they're gonna reach. And so how and this is something you do really well in your articles at the Libertarian Institute, is explaining how immoral the U.S. policies and our the justice system, the policing, the foreign wars, how unjust they are, because we sound absolutely crazy when we say the U.S. is committing a genocide in Yemen, and Barack Obama and John Brennan and Joe Biden and Dick Cheney and George Bush should all be in jail for war crimes, and we really do mean it.
Oh, yeah, I mean, we do. Yeah, and somebody had said yesterday that when the market was crashing, that, I remember when libertarians used to talk about ending the Fed and the Federal Reserve and everything, and I'm like, yeah, I talk about that all the time. You're just not paying attention. And Ron Paul does a show 5 days a week, and he's talking. That's all he's been talking about this week. And then this person tried. Well, a lot of those Ron Paul people are like Trump. I'm like, I want to see Trump swinging for the war crimes that he's committed. People, and people, when you say stuff like that, especially if they're a Trump fan, they immediately shut down. But this person I know, who I was speaking with, is somebody who would agree with us on foreign policy. So I knew how I could speak to him. it's just really hard to get through to people that the government is doing things that if you or I did it, we'd face a firing squad or, lethal injection. And why should they have that power? And where did they get that power from? They can't have that power because if I don't have that power and you don't have that power, how do we pass that power along to somebody else? How do we say, oh, you can go kill with impunity as long as you're keeping me safe? I don't care what you do. But because I can't do that. And if I got together with you, we still couldn't give someone the authorization to do that. If we got 3 more people and we had 5 people total, we couldn't do that. If we got 1 million people together who said, and we decided that we were going to give 30 people the power to commit to kill people with impunity, it still wouldn't be legitimate. So, what I always come down to as an anarchist is, how is the government legitimate? Where did they get their power to do this from? The people can't, I can't pass along a right that I don't that I don't possess myself. If I don't have the right to kill somebody because, they happen to be related to somebody who committed another crime, and, there's a chance, well, they could become radicalized, like happens all the time with Americans' foreign policy in the Middle East. How can I pass that right along to somebody else? The greatest question to ask people is, where did the government get the right to do this? And then when you start breaking it down to the fact that none of them as individuals have the right to do it, but you put this title upon them and then all of a sudden they have this right. Well, how do I have the right to even give them a title that I don't have, that I can't have? It's remarkable that it's all logic. And since logic isn't taught in schools, and being able to really think things, to think critically is not something that's taught in school. I mean, what are you taught in school? You're taught what you need to know. They're just telling you what to believe and what they think you need to know. Most schools, the overwhelming majority, especially if it's a government school, nobody's asking these questions. Nobody's taking the time to think, hey, wait a minute. That cop just killed somebody. The person was completely innocent, and they got a paid vacation. And when they got back, they went right back to their job. Well, who gave that cop the right to do that in the first place? To wear that uniform and to wear a badge that puts them above us. Where if they walk up to me in the street and they start asking me questions, and I don't want anything to do with it, I can't walk away. I can't tell them, F off. I'm walking away, because somebody who gave them the right to be able to escalate that violence all the way up to killing me because I don't want to talk to them. And it's it comes down to what Ron Paul talks about all the time. Every interaction should be voluntary. This should be a voluntary society. There should be no one that you can't say no to, that you can't disassociate from. But unfortunately, we live in a police state, and that doesn't exist. I say this all the time because I've studied the colonies, and there were colonists who redcoats would say stuff because the redcoats were the police in the colonies, and the colonists would tell them to F off, would tell them to go to hell and just walk away. The redcoats were not as bad as the police that we have today, and people don't want to hear that. But it's 100% true. All you have to do is read a couple books. But, that would take effort, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and, just to mention real quick, the redcoats and colonial America was something that you and Danny Sjursen talked a little bit about on a recent episode of your show that I thought was absolutely fantastic. I'm going to put in the show notes page. I hope you do another show with him soon, too, Mance. And, before we wrap up here, I guess I just want to ask, do you have any suggestions on, do you think the memes help break this down for people and understand that, like, all these many children are people and it's all murder? Or, how have you found success with your writing? And I know I talked to you about how you've used the memes before, but, with the writing at the Libertarian Institute, what's the best way messages this? Just outright saying that George Bush is a mass murderer and we need to throw him in a cage?
I honestly think that a lot of times memes communicate more than articles do. If I write 1,200 word article, it takes the average person about 5 minutes to read, maybe 6. Still, they don't want to do it. I cite my sources. If it's opinion, I'll let it be known it's opinion. But you throw some memes up on social media and people read them. It's remarkable to me the amount of people who have told me that, I used to think this, and I saw a meme that you posted and it totally changed my mind. Or I was a minarchist and now I'm an anarchist because of memes that you posted. Or I used to back the police no matter what, and now I see that they're illegitimate because of I did an episode where it really struck a lot of people that because I think I broke it down well, and I used the idea. I used all the facts about colonial life and everything, and how the redcoats are you'd prefer to live with the redcoats being the law than you would modern law in most cases. I understand some people live in small towns. They went to high school with their sheriff. They have dinner with them 2 or 3 times a lunch or something like that. Yeah, but that's not everybody. 85% of the population, within 100 miles of the coast, and it's just packed in. When everything's packed in, big cities, I live right outside of it. The police are way more of a stand in these cases. And the person who would say, well, if you don't like it, then move somewhere where it's smaller. Well, I hope that person realizes that by saying that, you're admitting that there's a problem with police. So now take it to its logical, so now take the step to start talking about how bad they are, because you've just admitted it.
All right, Pete. Well, thanks so much. If you got anything else to add, go ahead and do that. If not, let people know what you got going on. I know you got quite a few different projects that you're doing, and just a lot of important stuff that you have going on right now and coming out in the future. And also tell people where they could find your great memes online.
Well, Free Man Beyond the Wall podcast. You can get it on any podcatcher, and of course, libertarianinstitute.org. What else? Libertarianinstitute.org. Articles. I didn't write an article this week because I told you before we started recording, I've been doing so much stuff for documentary that I'll mention in a second. But my articles and my podcasts are up on libertarianinstitute.org. And I'm co-producer on a feature-length documentary called The Monopoly on Violence, which will explain a lot of this. A lot of what we talked about, but it'll also talk about the formation of the modern nations, Federal Reserve, everything that's bad about it, why it's illegitimate, and ways that alternatives to it, ways that we can have a more voluntary society, the ways that we can have a stateless society, and still be able to function rationally and prosperously. So look for that. My co-producer says he believes we're gonna have it out in May. It's only 2 months from now, so that excites me a lot. But those 3 things: podcast, articles, the Libertarian Institute. You can find me on Twitter at my name. It's Peter Ark, and you just look that up and you'll see me there. And on Facebook, same thing. I probably spend a little more time on Twitter than I do. I've been splitting it up pretty. Yeah, that's about it.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on the show.
I appreciate it, man. I really love what you do. And someone putting out a foreign policy podcast 3 days a week, that kudos to you, man. I think you do great work. And whenever I see a new episode, I try to share it around as much as I can.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thanks.
No problem, man. You have a good evening.
You too.